complicated, you know, man. It's like a dang old Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messing up.
If you share my lack of faith in our health system, you should take control of your well-being. Building resilience and maintaining good health for the long term needs to be a priority. Axios Remote Fitness Coaching offers one-stop expert advice on training, diet, and lifestyle. You can purchase customized workout plans for strength training or structured exercise. If you're serious about maximizing your potential, you can book time with a coach or customize your routine and get video feedback on your performance. I know the owner, and he's one of us. Visit Axios and support those who support the show. Follow the link in the description to become a man of action with Axios. No one blames you for being weak, but it's your fault if you stay that way. All right, Dan, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me back.
Yeah, I'm glad to speak with you again. You know, as I often say, this episode has been, a long time in the making, and I'm genuinely glad to have you back on. I enjoyed our first conversation, which was, a few months ago, quite a bit. And that was a more general episode, right? This one I think will be a little bit more specific.
Yeah, I quickly re-listened to it because I listened to everything about 2x speed, so it doesn't take me too long to catch up on stuff. But I listened to that just before coming on with you. I noticed that I was kind of black-pilled in that. The mood was low. I think it says some relatively interesting things in it, so I'm sort of happy with the podcast. But that sort of slightly depressed, black-pilled kind of attitude was coming out of me. And I think looking back, that was a bit of a low point for us because we had been so beaten down at that point. And one of the things that I referenced in that conversation was that, we have to be constantly careful of what we say. And look, all credit to Musk. I think the turning point, certainly for me, has been the liberation of Twitter. It is so great to be able to have somewhere where you can just say whatever the hell you want within our community. And I mean, looking back at sort of how I was sort of processing before that happened, we just felt so beat down. I don't know if you feel the same way, that it feels like something has changed.
Well, definitely. And one of my big complaints with people in our side of things is that there's a sort of like desire to constantly be right about everything that manifests as like eternal pessimism, right? Which you can never really win anything. And if you never
never show any optimism, otherwise,
right. And I think that people are right to say like, look, like Musk isn't our guy. Musk isn't perfect, and I would agree with that. But like, to be honest, even if there were two different sinister factions trying to control the world, that's way better than one. Because at least there's some market competition.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Competition between the elites is generally the best that you can ever hope for. And look, okay, he's not exactly our guy, but he's not that far off. And certainly he's sufficiently open to these old-fashioned sort of ideas such as free speech that we can do our thing. And he doesn't need to be one of our guys. So I feel a lot more positive in that. The other thing that I probably feel more positive about is, catching up from where we left off the last time, is of course since then I joined the Lotus Eaters. And I don't know if your audience is presumably primarily US, but that's a British version of, I don't know, Tim Pool or Crowd or something like that. And I go on there 1 or 2 days a week. And it's given me an outlet to start talking about the kind of things that matter to me. And I think one of those characters that I kind of need to be able to, express what I'm thinking without a filter. And probably what's changed between our last conversation and the new one is a combination of that. Lotus Eaters and Twitter. I can now speak my mind, and I think it's doing great for my mental health, to be honest.
I know what you mean. And look, like, people who follow the show will know that, I'm far from like the edgiest guy in our sphere. But it is incredibly demoralizing to always have that thought in the back of your mind that it's like, oh no, like if I say what I think about this, I lose all of this effort, put into this project of mine. And so again, right, like a win is a win, and I think that it's certainly foolish to essentially, snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory, right?
Yeah, I mean we're still too dependent on YouTube. It's still too dominant. I've spoken to people who are trying to put more across on Twitter. The only person who's really working for at the moment is Tucker, but I don't think he's even monetizing that at the moment. So the alternative models aren't there, but it feels like things are starting to move a little bit our way. Plus, the other thing, of course, is that Biden. I mean, what can we say about Biden? He has failed so excessively, so comprehensively, that any sort of energy out of the satisfaction of having fortified the last election and getting their guy over the line, that's ringing really hollow for them. So all around a bit more energy on our side.
Well, definitely, and I think that there is a feeling of entropy kind of around the regime, where it's like it's a little bit easier to kind of lie to yourself and be like, oh yeah, Obama, he's it. He's going to usher in, whatever, libtard utopia looks like, John Lennon's Imagine. But I'm going to be honest, right? Like, I'm not the biggest, like, current party politics guy. That's not really my beat, but
yeah,
like it's kind of hard to be actively excited about Joe Biden. And it seems like even after the election or during the election, the play was always better than Orange Man, not I like Joe Biden. And I think that, and this can kind of lead us, more neatly into our topic, is there is this feeling that, the regime is kind of fighting gravity, and there's sort of this feeling that like,
well, they definitely fight reality. They do that every day.
Right. That drag is starting to catch up to them, one way or another.
Yeah. I mean, look, put it this way. If I had become US president when Joe Biden did, and my sole mission was to, as comprehensively and quickly, diminish the US on the world stage, its prospects, its economy, and everything else, its military standing, I genuinely don't think that I could have done a better job than Joe Biden. Whether he is deliberately trying to do that, or whether it is epic incompetence, or whatever it is, but I mean, the absolute demolition, and I know we're going to get into this when we start talking about the economy and the debt and so on, and the US's world standing. It's genuinely impressive how effective he has been as an agent of chaos, really.
And so let's bring this about, more explicitly, kind of the focus of this. And I'll read out a tweet that you posted a while back. And I'll put it this way: I very rarely bookmark tweets. Most of the tweets that I have bookmarked are related to my other interests, right? Not political at all. You're like, oh, that's an interesting photo, or that's something neat. I'll come back to that. But I bookmarked this because I thought it was a really interesting idea, and I'll read it out in whole. This is responding to a newspaper clipping someone else posted on May 29th, and the headline was "Blair calls for pension super funds," end quote. Dan, I've never put a penny in a pension because the chances some future government will steal it is close to 100%. And then next part in the thread, pick one: A, the boomers get theirs, or B, you get yours. Reality doesn't support both. And which do you think wins here? And so I want to get into that. But this kind of started a process in my mind of looking at kind of debt as entropy, right, in the current world system. Because we've had kind of two snapshots, which have been kind of useful. There's the UK/European debt crisis, right, which is very much tied to pensions for the elderly. This is what this super fund story is connected to, and we can get into details later. And then on the other hand, right, there's been the so-called debt crisis in the US, which basically has to do with the amount of debt the federal government is allowed to hold. So very briefly, as kind of a framing device, do you want to explain that story of pension super funds in the UK?
Oh yeah, that was essentially an idea where we need more money because we've borrowed all the money that we can at a reasonable rate. We've spent all of the taxes, but there is stuff that we want to do for our political projects. Regeneration of certain areas or whatever it is, and because we've exhausted all the existing supplies of money, where can we find some? And we're thinking is, oh, okay, well, look, there's many hundreds of billions, probably trillions wrapped up in these British pensions. Why don't we just dragoon some of that into being used for our political project? Now, this is probably the first time I've explicitly heard that stated, but that goes to the point in the tweet, is that with pension money, it is tax efficient, but it is locked away for a long time. So, I mean, you appreciate this because I know you have some sort of expertise when it comes to sort of personal wealth management. I'm not completely against it in all circumstances. So, for example, the way it works in the UK is you get tax relief when you put money into a pension, but you don't get money when you don't get tax relief when you take it out. So let's say you are on the verge of retirement, then yeah, by all means, shovel as much money into your pension as you can, because you get that tax relief as it goes in, and then you can sort of take it out, a couple of years later if you're on the cusp of it, and then that money is yours. But let's say you're a younger person, let's say you're in your 20s or 30s, that money is going to be locked up for a couple of decades, and the temptation for some future government to steal it for exactly the reasons that I've outlined, but they have exhausted the other avenues through which they can access capital, is I think is just going to be too high. Now, maybe they don't do it, but the risk is, I don't know, it's at very minimum a 20% risk that they're going to do that, and that is unacceptable levels of risk for me when there are other alternatives that do not employ that level of risk.
Well, and it's interesting because the same thing has already happened in the US, right? That Social Security is this program, set up, and it is sort of the great albatross around the neck of the American Republic, right? Where it was kind of designed as this, effective Ponzi scheme, where it was an idea is, that you're taxed on every paycheck and you can take it out when you're 62, at which point, when this bill was passed, a significant majority of people would already have been dead, or they would live for another 2 or 3 years, right?
Yeah, well, they presented it as that. I mean, of course, you're not actually accumulating anything. It is pay as you go. So as soon as money gets paid in, it immediately gets paid out to the people who are receiving at the time, and you just kind of hope that when you come to retire, that there are people paying in order for you to get some out.
Well, right. And that's the Ponzi scheme aspect to it, right? They're like, oh, of course, the government's allowed to do that. But if you tried with your friends, well, of course, we throw you in jail. But there is this kind of creeping meme. And I mean that in the kind of like the Dawkins sense, right? A social idea that essentially Social Security is not going to be around. Like so much so that's what I was taught in school. Like, do not depend on Social Security. It will be gone. And
what? Oh, yeah. Sorry, carry on.
No, that was the end of the thought.
Okay, so I mean, essentially, what's going on here is a question of demographics, and that's why it's so easy to understand, what the situation is going to be going forwards. So let's explain how we got into this situation and why it's so inevitable that it's not going to work. The reason we got into this situation is because the world in, the say 1950s was a much smaller world. There were many fewer people than there are today. The baby boomers started to arrive in the 50s and into the 60s. And the baby boomers were a very large generation going into a very small world. So it significantly increased the population, and the boomers remain, in percentage terms, the largest increase, the largest generation in history. Even though the millennial generation is slightly larger in absolute terms, but in a sort of rate of change from the existing population, that the boomers were massive, and it made a huge change. Now, what happened is those boomers then grew up. They started to dominate the world. I mean, there's so many of them that they were able to vote their interests. But I mean, actually, I think the primary motivation was actually altruistic, because those who were older than them, so their grandparents and their parents, old people in the 70s and 80s was basically synonymous with poor people. So if you were a politician and you wanted to do something good for poor people, a very easy way of achieving that was to just do it for old people, because there was, you don't even need to means test it, because yes, there were the occasional wealthy elderly person back then, but it was very uncommon. So what they did is they started to introduce a whole range of social insurance programs. Well, a lot of these already existed, but they significantly expanded them and made them more generous. So in my case, that's going to be the NHS, it's going to be pensions and welfare, and yours, of course, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and so on, where these social insurance programs were made ever more generous. And because, as we've talked about, these were done on a pay-as-you-go basis, it is simply very easy for a large generation to be generous to a smaller generation above them. The problem we got now is that large generation are themselves retiring. And it is a fundamentally mathematically different proposition for a large number of people to be generous to a small number of people than it is for a population to be generous to an equally large population above them that are retiring. And in addition to that, the result of moving through life as part of a large generation has been very good to the boomers. So I appreciate that there are going to be many boomers who are not financially advantaged, but I think something like 1 in 4 are millionaires. It's not particularly difficult to do, given what's happened to property prices, but it is a fundamental change. If you look at how to describe this, disposable income, for example, the disposable income for a retired boomer is actually about the same as it is for a working age person in their prime. Completely different to the situation that you would have found in the 80s and 90s. And actually, if you look at the disposable spending for the bottom 20% of boomers versus 20% of working at the moment, it's significantly higher for the boomers. So what you've got is you've got a whole series of promises that have been made where there is, I mean, you can just work it out because, I mean, you know who's been born. You can project it forward. The people being born today, even if there is another baby boom, you know, they're not going to make any difference at this point because they won't be entering the working age until this crisis is hit. You know, the numbers simply don't add up anymore. We are not going to make it through to the other side of the boomers' time on this earth with the finances intact. It's simple demographic projection, and basic maths that you can tell you that this isn't going to work.
And this is an issue that is kind of inextricably tied to mass migration, right? Because essentially there's a line of thought, and I was taught this in business school, which essentially goes, right, given that premise that you laid out, Dan, right, that it's very difficult for a small number of people to be generous to a larger one. Well, if we just increase the amount of people, taxpayers, well, that will re-even the books. Is that something that is kind of explicitly stated in the European context, or is that mostly an American argument?
No, I mean, Europe and the UK are doing exactly the same thing, and it's certainly explicit when the politicians don't come out as such. Well, sometimes they do say it. Yeah, sometimes they do actually say it, but it's very explicit when you're looking at it the way I look at it, which is just to look at the underlying numbers and the assumptions that go into that, because you'll see government projections of finance, which basically say, okay, so the average GDP per head, for example, is this much for the existing population. Therefore, if we import an extra million people, all of those are going to be kicking in the same. There is this assumption that you can just, land people from Somalia, chuck them into British cities, and then all of a sudden these people are going to be, performing economically exactly the same as the original population did. And they've got some minor justification for doing this, because it used to be the case that we were very selective about who we let in, and the people coming in genuinely were well-educated, talented people. It actually was a lot of the time, doctors and architects and engineers. But since the Tony Blair era, basically the floodgates have been opened, and now it is, it's basically anybody who wants to come here or can get a dinghy across the English Channel. Now, these people are not contributing in anything like, well, in fact, they're net negative. That's perfectly clear from the figures, but the government likes to pretend that the old assumptions hold up, And part of the reason they like to make they like to pretend that is the case is because then their forward projections look good, which enable them to do the other thing that they want to do, which is borrow as much money. If their future projections were as bad as I think they should be, then they wouldn't be able to borrow the amount of money that they're borrowing currently.
Okay, that's clearly explained. So I want to slightly pivot to another debt-related story in the U.S., right, which is the debt ceiling, rather. Excuse me.
So debt stealing is absolutely fine.
Yeah, maybe it was a Freudian slip, right? And this is interesting to me because I remember very clearly the last time we really got close to defaulting, essentially, when there was
2011,
no more money. Right. I was 12 years old. And I remember very clearly, like, oh, you couldn't go to state parks, for instance, things run by the government because there was simply no money to do it. So if you could you kind of explain to, the viewer who might not have that background, what happened explicitly?
Yeah. So, the full background is that during the First World War, the U.S. Congress decided, rather than authorizing each individual piece of spending and debt that went forward, they would just set a ceiling and then just periodically let that rise or vote to increase it or suspend it. That has become a bit of a political football ever since. It's a fairly unusual feature. Most countries don't have this, but that's the way that they choose to operate. Very questionable as to whether it is constitutional. There's good arguments that it isn't, but it's been around for whatever 80 odd years at this, over 100 years, and it hasn't been pushed back on. So it's fairly safe at this point. Now, the Republicans like to present themselves, at least outwardly, they like to present themselves as being a small state, low tax party. And the particular circumstances around 2011 were that the Tea Party had gained a lot of traction. So even for the regular swamp creature rhinos, they understood that they needed to at least present themselves as being how to put it, as being what they proclaim to be more vociferously. So when the debt ceiling started to be approached, they basically sort of dug in their heels and said, no, we want spending cuts. The Democrats wouldn't let them do it. And so the government, it actually reached the debt ceiling, at which point the government had to content itself with spending only the money that it raised in taxes. Now, I don't actually remember what it was at the time, but I mean, I'm familiar with the figures today. Today, the US government is spending, is raising in tax revenue about 4.7 trillion a year, and it's spending about 6.1 trillion. So if it were to be no longer able to borrow additional money, it would simply have to cut the spending to match the income, which in the US's case at the moment would be about a 22% cut. So when this hit back in 2011, and there was that brief period where the government could not borrow any more money, the political rhetoric was dialed up to 11, and the Democrats used, from their point of view, they used fairly smart tactics. So what did they cut? Well, it wasn't the unpopular things. It wasn't the pork barrel spending. It wasn't the military. It was, all the national parks are going to be closed. Anything popular, because a large proportion of state spending is actually popular. So anything that was vaguely popular was immediately cut down, and it was kind of absurd. I mean, for example, things like the Lincoln Monument was kind of fenced off so that you couldn't go near it. That would have cost more money than simply the people who maintain it being sent home. They actively fenced it off, and they were extremely aggressive towards the US population in any way that they could be, in order to emphasize the fact that this is a crisis and that you need to get on to your Republican senator or congressman and demand that they change the policy. In fact, in many ways, for me, it was a foreshadowing of the COVID restrictions and that sort of bureaucratic aggression towards the population who didn't comply with they wanted to go. Now, the significant difference between 2011 and now is that social media, alternative media was in existence, but it was very nascent. By far and away, the loudest bullhorn would have been mainstream media. And of course, as we know, the mainstream media is Democrat partisans. So the Republicans essentially lost the argument and they had to capitulate. And I can understand why they capitulated. I mean, it's a shame they did, but I can understand why they capitulated in 2011. However, many of those conditions that I've just laid out were not the case this time round. So a lot of us were hoping that this time the Republicans would see it through. But of course, you've got McCarthy there.
And so that actually brings up an interesting question, right? Which is basically, why does this matter? You know, what happens if they default? Like, obviously, they don't have the money to do, you know, what they want to do, right? The pork barrel spending, you know, open the parks. But is there a broader economic reason why the U.S., you know, kind of being unable to meet their debts would be bad?
Well, I mean, the thing is, they would be able to. I mean, all of the stuff that they told you would be imperiled by not raising the debt. I mean, all of that is nonsense. Biden came out and said, okay, well, the first thing we're going to cut is the water inspectors and, what was it else? School. I mean, basically everything popular, they suggested they were going to cut, and they were going to default on the debt, that they wouldn't make interest payments. Bear in mind, they still have 4.7, whatever it is, trillion coming in. It's just that they would have had to have cut that spending by around 22%. If you cut out the unpopular bits of the government, I mean, you could pay the interest, you could pay Social Security, at least for now anyway. You could pay out Medicare, Medicaid, you could pay the water inspectors, you could keep the national parks open, you could even fund a decent chunk of the military, but you would have to cut out, all of the all of the things that wouldn't get support, and so that could have been done, because what they needed to do was present it as, if this debt ceiling isn't raised, well, the US will default on its debt, and it will cause economic malaise, and we'd be Welchers and all the rest of it. But that's not really true.
So that's interesting, because in my research for this, one of the most commonly reported claims was this idea that if the US hit the debt ceiling, had to make cuts, that they would be unable to meet their debt obligations, and they would be downgraded as a lender, which would cause a massive spiral, because essentially US Treasury bonds are kind of seen as, which is a way that the government, essentially like sells its debt, to put it, in simple terms. If those were downgraded, to a lower rating, it would cause chaos through the entire financial sector, because those are kind of viewed as baseline. So you're saying is that's incorrect?
Well, yeah, I mean, if that actually happened, then yes, there would be, significant disruption and all the rest of it. But that was that never actually needed to happen, because they could have continued servicing the interest. It was in their interests to make you believe that they would not be able to pay the interest, because then they can go on to make the argument that you've just made. But actually, like I say, they've got that 4.7 trillion coming in, so they could have paid the interest. They could have done all of those social programs that you talked about, at least for now. They could have done a decent chunk of the military, national parks, all the rest of it. That could have continued, but they could have filtered out. They could have found other things to make that 22% of cuts that they would have needed to made. Now, yes, if they had have actually not paid the interest on the treasuries and the rest of it, then yeah, it would have been many of those disruptions that you talked about would have come to pass. Now, actually, a lot of that, if it had happened, might have been in the US's interest over the long term. Ripping the bandage off, getting away from this obsession with debt. But it is incorrect to say that would have necessarily followed from not being able to borrow more money.
So one of the things that I'm kind of naturally resistant to, and it's because I very much grew up in the era of the Tea Party, right? I remember the Obama years very well. And, a lot of the shall we say, like what would become the American populist movement was kind of motivated towards, fiscal concerns, right? Like concerned about debt, concerned about, the deficit. I remember, right, in kind of the conservative heartland, it was pretty common to find debt trackers in public, right? There'd be an LCD screen on the side of the road, and it was counting up consistently. So it was very much in the air. Do you consider that this is kind of a political football where it's just like it's a useful way to, swing at the opposition? Or do you view this as something that there's actually like a real constituency interested in ending kind of the US's, and maybe even we can talk about your own country's addiction to debt?
Well, let's just zoom out for a moment and talk about the bigger debt issue, because I think it's germane to the point. The Western world is being swallowed by their debt. I mean, you can think about this in very simple terms. So the amount of debt that the US and actually a lot of other Western nations have is about 100% of GDP. That's the case for the US. It's the case for UK. France and France is a bit higher, Germany's a bit lower, but essentially we're all sort of hovering around that sort of 100% mark. And that makes the maths of this fairly easy, because the debt servicing costs on a lot of this stuff is coming out at the moment at around 2%. GDP growth is about 2%. So effectively what that means is that all of the GDP growth is going just to service the debt. So there is no growing out of this unless there is a productivity miracle that comes along. What would a productivity miracle look like? I know, cracking cold fusion, general AI, and robotics that takes over, and all the factories are full of robots, just churning out stuff 24 hours a day. I mean, it would be that. I mean, that would create other problems, other deflationary trends, and displace workers and so on. But unless something really fundamental changes with the amount of output that the economy produces, we are now in a debt spiral. And what that means is that the debt pile is going to grow larger and larger until it consumes everything. Now, that's not desperately imminent. We're at the point now where we have tipped over the edge essentially, and the debt is growing that much faster than the rest of the economy, and there appears to be no way out of it. And it's a bit like that, that Austin Powers scene of the henchman being run over by the steamroller. I mean, what's going to happen. You can see it coming. If you continue to just lie there, you're going to get crushed, and it's going to take a long time. But nobody appears to want. Well, I mean, there is a constituency of people who want to cut this spending down to size, but those people are not in Washington. That's your essential problem.
So that's it's an interesting way to look at it, right? Because, and that's why I kind of likened it to gravity, earlier, where it does sort of seem, right, that there was this game played where it was kind of continually betting that we could grow and grow and grow forever. And we were kind of able to keep it up for a few decades. Like it kind of worked for a while, and that made it much harder to go back. But the problem is, right, essentially we've got to the point where our betting on our future returns, which is essentially what debt is, right? To put it in very simple terms, has become something we're almost incapable of getting rid of. Like it's gone from a bit of a habit, kind of like holidays and weekends, right? To a little, to something you kind of need to get through the day. Right, to mix metaphors. And to me, right, it's one of the really interesting things is kind of when reality catches up with us, because there is this kind of like Cassandra-like tendency, on the broad right, to say like, oh, the end's coming, it'll be Mad Max tomorrow. But at the same time, right, quite literally, what goes up must come down. So do you see any signs that this kind of like debt bubble is approaching, some kind of crisis? Or do you think that we can kind of keep in that mode of business as usual for longer?
Oh no, the crisis is definitely, the crisis is here. The crisis is approaching, but it's a slow motion one. It's not going to be Mad Max tomorrow. It's going to be this sort of slow grinding down, this squeezing out of basically everything's going to be sucked up into government spending and debt servicing over time. Now it's going to take it's going to take the course of 20 years for this to sort of grind down to the point where it will truly break. But I mean, you take for example the Soviet Union. I mean, the economy never really broke. It just got ground down further and further and became more and more dysfunctional, and people got squeezed even more. So it's not like there's a breaking point. Everything's fine, and then it breaks. And I suppose that could actually happen with some of the other things that are happening in the financial services. But yeah, I mean, we are definitely in a big debt problem now. Let's frame it like this. What is the issue here? I mean, the issue is that Western governments are spending as if they are on a total war setting. We have had levels of spending this high in the past, but it has been associated with a major war like World War I or World War II. Western governments are again spending at that sort of level. But here's the difference between then and now. Wars end. Whereas the spending that's taking place in Western nations at the moment, I mean, it's basically all social programs. It is it's welfare and pensions and medical provision. In the US is also a high degree of military spending. But when are these? When is the war going to be won against these social issues? People are going to continue to get sick. People are going to continue to be idle. And there isn't going to be a point where this just we can declare victory and this is going to stop. And it is completely unviable for politicians to get elected by saying, oh, yeah, we're going to, in the UK, it's unthinkable that a politician could come along and say, I'm going to cut the NHS. Simply unthinkable. I would imagine that is very much the case in the US with, say, Social Security as well. So there is no desire to cut spending amongst politicians because they know they wouldn't get elected. And at the same time, we've now reached that tipping point where everything else is getting crowded out. And all resources are being sucked into this government and this debt trap. So at some point, I would hope something is going to break, but it could take a long time to get to that.
Well, and I think that one of the other pieces of this that can't be ignored is that there are certain segments of the population that are essentially more productive than others, right? So the classic example is men and women taken as aggregate, right? So that's the entirety of the population. And men are net producers for most of their lives. Like it roughly tips over, how much it costs to send you to school, the amount of, resources you consumed as a child, right? That's obviously puts you in the negative. But by the time you're in your, late 20s, you've essentially paid that back in taxes, right? And by the time you're in your late 50s, right before you retire, you're effectively printing money for the government as a man, generally speaking, of course. Yeah. Whereas women, right, never really reach net contribution status and only start kind of decreasing the amount that they're costing by, their mid 30s, right? If they work their entire lives. And the problem is, right, when you have a system that is sort of like religiously addicted to promoting, we'll just use women as an example, right? Putting them into higher paying jobs, putting them into more, kind of like high status, situations.
And their voting habits is the big concern.
Right. You essentially are not only decreasing the ability of net contributors to pay out, but you're also basically telling people, and especially young men, that basically don't contribute to the system. It's not worth it. And there have been a series of news articles, I could, pull up any number of them. They're essentially talking or cracking the rise of essentially male non-participation, where there's a number of men, my age, your age, who've essentially basically said to hell with it, I'm done, well before they quote unquote should have. And so in addition to just being, fiscally difficult, right, where it's we're already featuring, this financial crunch, we're basically sawing away at the limb that we sit on, so to speak.
Yeah, it's just crazy, isn't it? The economics and the politics of this is bad enough, but once you start getting into these sort of social wars that are taking place, the sort of destruction of anything that, you know, good and of value. I mean, you put this together and you really think, okay, well, how much longer has the West got left in it? In all of the things that you just talked about, you know, it's just driving people away. And yeah, I mean, I really can't blame you know, a young man. I mean, I think I'm a bit older than you. I mean, and I did get married and I've got kids and I'm, you know, very happy with my life. But yeah, I mean, if I was a young man, I would, you know, seeing how the world has changed in the last 20 years, I would have serious reservations about, you know, entering into a marriage contract, or basically even continuing on with the West. I think I would be looking at alternatives, just because, you know, for the reasons you outline, you get, you know, so you're getting walked on, you know, aren't you? You're getting walked on by society and by the government and all the rest of it. So, you know, why not just either make do or exit the system?
Excuse me, I was muted. So we spoke at the beginning about how, you know, you felt that we were kind of overly, you know, black-pilled on our last episode. And I fear that we're almost kind of verging into the same territory here.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, do you see there as being any kind of upside to this situation, to this debt bomb?
I think the upside is more about what we talked about earlier, is that, you know, if there is a conversation that is able to take place, if people are starting to wake up to actually the government is not a good thing, that it makes problems worse rather than solves them. You know, I would much rather, you know, if you gave me a choice of resetting, say, the debt back to zero, but, you know, gave us a political situation where you couldn't discuss these things and the left wing ascendancy and all the rest of it, you know, basically the rate of decline was going to, you know, continue and accelerate, versus the situation we're in now, which is, you know, very high levels of debt and dysfunction, but the society was able to talk about it, address it and have an honest conversation. I would take the second one every time. Now we don't really have that at the moment. It's just that it is starting to break through. Twitter was a genuine advantage that we can start to address these things, and also, of course, that we can have conversations about it. You know, Lotus Eaters is doing great. You know, we get, you know, for every video that we put out, you know, we get 100,000 viewers. So if I want to talk about the debt ceiling or the debt or whatever else, I can do it and I can get that message out there. So I'm encouraged about the thing. I was so despondent before because all of this stuff was as bad as it was then, but there appeared to be no way that we could even get into the conversation. Whereas now, you know, all of that stuff is still bad, but, you know, we can have a conversation about it. So, you know, that gives me some encouragement. But I mean, yes, certainly you can't underestimate the scale of the problem that we have. And of course, you know, maybe we should move on to, you know, another theme before long, which is, if you are going to come out of this, you want to have, you know, as many aces in your hand as you can. And what I mean, certainly what the US currently has is a political leadership which is systematically destroying every advantage on the global stage that it has. At least you do have some political recourse there. In the UK, we've got the sort of same, you know, decline management globalists, but there is no prospect of getting rid of them, certainly at the moment. So that is deeply concerning.
I think that one other thing that is sort of hopeful about this, right, is that essentially all of the excesses of, you know, the global American empire are essentially kind of funded by their ability to essentially print funny money. You know, they are the monopoly bank, and so that allows them to kind of do all of the things that they want to do that don't make sense, right? That don't kind of, like, you know, line up with reality. And if you are kind of bound to normal traditional economics, right, like you and I are, you kind of have to take into account reality. And so in a weird way, right, it sort of provides losing that ability, losing that kind of like capability to just like make infinity dollars and have them still be worth something. When that goes away, the ability of the current elites to just do whatever they want also goes away. And I think that might be, just kind of spitballing from my own perspective, that might be the moment at which we see a reordering of elites, to put it mildly. But to go back to what.
Yeah, I was just going to say that transition, if it happens in an unstructured way, it would be, it would be astonishing to behold, and it would be incredibly disruption. I mean, essentially because there is a vast amount of dollars out there. I mean, nobody really even knows how many dollars are out there, and partly that's because for global trade is normally done in dollars, although the share of the dollar is falling, and also because it is a store of value. Now, Biden has significantly disrupted both of those, but if the dollar were to fall from grace and an alternative were to rise, and perhaps if you want, we can talk about what those alternatives might look like if you want to get into sort of China and BRICS and all the rest of it. If that moment were to happen, then what you would see is governments, corporations around the world abandoning the dollar. Those dollars would flood home, and you'd be in a situation where a vast amount of dollars come back to the US, and the inflation that you would experience would be eye-watering. I mean, it would solve your debt problem because suddenly you would have no shortage of dollars swashing around. But yeah, the disruption, at least on the short term, to the US would be staggering.
So that's actually an interesting, way to kind of, extend this conversation, which is, obviously you and I are not the only ones noticing this. Global players, right? People who are more important than you and I are seeing these signs as well and are kind of acting accordingly. So what are the ways in which, other nations, other countries are kind of reordering things to kind of distance themselves from, the US economic empire?
Well, I mean, they're looking for alternatives. So, I mean, let's split it down how I split it down before, which is the dollar as for trade. The share of dollars used for trade had been going down fairly steadily. What is it now? I should know these numbers, but it's something like the mid 40s is all global transactions are exchanged in dollars. Now, the US is something like 25% of global GDP. So you get the first 25% for free. And it used to be significantly higher than that, but people are moving away from that. A big element of that, of course, is going to be the petrodollar, where the US essentially says, would you like to buy and sell your energy in dollars, or would you prefer to be invaded? It's up to you. So that's going to be a significant element. But people are coming back from that. An interesting point, to go at a slight tangent, is to take us back a couple of years. The only so the most viable second option from the dollar a few years ago would have been the euro. What's happened since then? Well, the dollar has come under stress, and then it just so happened that an international conflict started. Many things have come about as a result of that international conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but one of them has been the fundamental undermining of the euro. Essentially, and that's because the euro, the currency of the EU, I mean, it's really underpinned by Germany. I mean, it's supposed to be 26 nations and all the rest of it, but no, it was Germany. And what was Germany's viability based on? Well, it was a 5 trillion euro economy that was resting on 50 billion of cheap Russian energy, and that has been knocked out from under them. Their energy prices are increasing significantly, and we're seeing the slow industrialization of Germany as a result. So what that has done is it has undermined the euro. Now, I just think it's interesting that at just the moment that the US could have done with sweeping the legs out of a rival, a set of circumstances came along that allowed them to achieve exactly that. And I suppose I'm referencing the Nord Stream pipeline attack as much as anything else. So, I I went on that tangent. What was the original question? Where was I supposed to be getting to?
The original question was, how are other countries reacting to distance themselves from the U.S.? And you've sort of answered the converse, right? Which is its own helpful, answer, which is basically, how is the U.S. stopping people from jumping ship, right?
Yeah. Well, and the other side of it is the attacks on crypto and all the rest of it. I mean, there's like a whole number of different threads that lead into this. The other side of it is the US, Biden's crazy response to basically seize the dollar-denominated assets of the Russian central bank. Now, this is a feature of the Biden regime, is that he seems to think that he can conduct international politics in the same way that he conducts national politics. So the way he conducts national politics is to vilify anybody he doesn't like and take the most extreme possible measures against them. You can get away with that when it comes to national politics, at least for a time. You can't get away with that when you are doing it on the international stage. So, by seizing those Russian foreign reserves, which, by the way, to show you how crazy that is not something that was even done to the Germans in World War II. So it was truly unprecedented. And what it did is it said to everybody around the world is, if you don't do what the US tells you to do, you can find that your reserves suddenly vanish, which is a very clear message, which is, don't hold any more dollars than you need to just to do the trade element. For a store of value, you need to get out of it. So at the moment, what is happening is the world is basically having that conversation with each other is, okay, what else do we use? I would imagine that gold is going to be an element of that. And the BRICS currency is basically looking to capitalize on that. Where it comes out, I don't know, but the strong motivation is to ditch the dollar, which perhaps would have happened in time, but Biden has accelerated it to an unfortunate degree.
Well, fair enough, Dan. Thank you for coming back on. We are coming out. We're coming up on time. So if people want to find more of your work, where they can hear you talk about this stuff and others, what's a good place for them to check you out?
Well, I'm on Lotus Eaters, so you can go to that. I've got the Twitter, which is King Bingo _. If people want a good summary as to what's happening on the economic front, and they just want a broad overview, I have a whole Brokenomics series on Lotus Eaters. But a good way of getting into it is the initial episode, which is Brokenomics 1, and you can find that on YouTube if you just type in Brokenomics 1. We put up the full first episode, and that gives you basically the big overview of geopolitics and the economy and the fall of the West, fiat currencies. So that's probably, if you're interested in any of the stuff that I've talked about, go to there, and then if you like it, follow up on some of those other platforms.
Well, great. And I can, fully recommend Dan's work. I find it, quite useful, even as someone who's kind of inside the industry, to put it that way. You bring up things that I've often not considered, or sources I haven't really, I'm not familiar with. So it's well worth your time. And as far as my stuff, you guys know where to find me. The show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. This is the first episode on a new audio mixer. So hopefully that has solved, the long-running audio issues with the show. Hopefully I won't get 1,001 comments about how I'm too quiet. And again, Dan, thank you so much for coming on.
Genuine pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. And remember, guys, thank you so much for coming out. I really do appreciate it, especially for bearing with me as the show's gone through a lot of changes. But you know what? I think this is the new setup, the new audio and the new schedule. And I'm looking forward to it. We got a lot of good guests, coming down the pipe. So if you want to, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe, ring the bell, do all those normal, YouTube or podcast things, because it does help me out with my, bizarre little podcast hobby. Anyway, guys, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.